Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Saganesh Saramab, an assistant professor in the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Minnesota Medical School. Welcome to our second session of Mini Medical School, Healthy Planet and Healthy Lives. We're excited to have you here today, and we look forward to guiding you through our second topic in the series. What can we do to bring about change? We hope you were here last week and got to hear the introduction on planetary health. And if you're not able to, we encourage you to watch the recording after this session. It was phenomenal. We'll begin with a moderated discussion today, followed by a question and answer session. You can submit your questions to the panelists at any time using the question and answer box, which is found by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Please note, this session is being recorded and it will be available starting tomorrow on the Office of Academic Clinical Affairs YouTube channel, and we will share the link of the recording with you by email. Last week, we got to discuss the definitions of planetary health, which I hope you were able to see in that introductory slide, and also how planetary health affects rural communities, how this work is grounded and informed by Indigenous framework. And today we have the privilege of speaking with a panel of experts on ways that we can help improve planetary health. I want to introduce you to our panelists. We'll get to hear from all of them. But first, we're going to start with Michael Reese. Mr. Reese has been the Renewable Energy Director at the University of Minnesota West Central Research and Outreach Center in Morris since 2001. He has overseen the development of the renewable energy program at Morris and has participated as the principal investigator or project manager on more than $18 million worth of research and demonstration projects. That includes things like wind energy and biomass gasification, renewable hydrogen and ammonia, and solar energy systems. So, Mr. Reese, can you share with us more about this Morris model of sustainability?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Saganesh. I'm going to share my screen here. Get started. Today, I'm going to visit with you about what we call the Morris model. And it's a community. First of all, can you just see my screen, everyone? Or Saganesh? Okay, good. I'm getting a dialog box, so that's why I stopped. Thank you so much again. I'm going to share with you information today about our effort called the Morris Model. It's a community effort. Again, I have some dialog boxes I need to close here so I can see my slides. But again, first question might be, what is the Morris Model? Well, it's a loose group of organizations and stakeholders within the Morris and Stevens County community looking to advance goals in the areas of energy, transportation, waste reduction, recycling, and then, of course, the education of these topics. It has evolved to empower individuals and organizations to make practical steps toward sustainable energy and community resilience. Some of the significant steps we took, we hosted a community planning retreat, and this was in October 2018. We had about 35 people that participated. We went off to a different location so we could focus on, over the day and a half, we could focus on some of the pressing issues that our community faces. In addition to that, we came away with that with a strategic goal plan, and we went around to the other organizations and received commitments for that plan. And a project list was developed, and we started working on projects. And that was kind of the whole plan. Is, you know, we didn't know how to organize initially. We said we need a strategic plan, and once we had the plan in place, projects just seemed to come to us. And throughout this process, the Morris Model team, which comprises of various stakeholders, including the University of Minnesota, the City of Morris, the county, the hospital, the school system, all come together, and we've organized events such as EV showcases. We've hosted camps for Morris students. In addition, we advocated for funding for a coordinator, which we received. And then we've also worked on renewable energy systems such as solar PV system for the high school, $30 million biogas upgrade plant, for our rural area, and then electric buses and many other efforts. Here's a picture of all the people that participated in the strategic planning retreat. And 35 people may not sound like many people, but for a small community like Morris, it is quite a commitment to have those 35 people going across the cross section of public and private groups and NGOs and individual citizens. So we developed this strategic plan. We developed a vision. We wanted to produce all the energy locally that we are consuming within our county. Wanted to provide greater opportunities for ownership of energy production. We wanted to inspire a new conservation ethic for saving energy and reducing waste. Many of you remember back when you were growing up, your parents always said, "Shut that light off." And I think that energy ethic may have and conservation ethic may have been lost. And so we're trying to bring that back and trying to create that within young people. And then we want to develop innovative educational programming for students and all community members, and then become a destination for those wanting to learn and for businesses wanting to participate. So we also developed 3 big goals to work towards. We wanted to produce 80% of the energy that we consume in the county locally. We wanted to reduce energy consumption 30% by 2030. And then we also set a big goal to eliminate landfilling of waste within the county by 2025. So Morris is a small community. We have about 5,300 people, about 2,000 households. Stevens County is not much bigger, less than 10,000 people. But overall, we consume about $112 million worth of energy every year. And this is an estimate, but that's a significant amount of money that we could put back into our community, but also it has significant potential environmental and climate impacts as well. So what have the outcomes been to date? We participate in the University of Minnesota INE Climate Smart Municipality Program, partnership with several communities in Minnesota and partnering with communities in Germany to address these issues around climate change and climate mitigation. We've established solar PV systems across the community, and electric buses and public transit vans have also been part of this change. We've established electric charging stations. The county has organized the organics recycling program, which basically eliminates about 40% of our landfill waste. So we're making a huge step by going into that organic program. We've also have leading edge applied energy research. We established a Center for Energy Storage Technologies. We're working in renewable hydrogen and ammonia and flow batteries and agrivoltaics at the University of Minnesota. We've had positive news stories from New York Times, Washington Post, PBS Nova, and many other examples. We've had student participation, which is one of our goals from the university standpoint, and that's where this all needs to be. We have to pass this on to future generations. Then we've created significant public awareness. So here's, I mentioned the New York Times. Here's the article where Morris was featured in just this past summer, July 1st. And I bring this up because the second sentence in the article said, "The liquor store in Farmingtown in Morris, Minnesota cools its beer with solar power." So you can't get much better publicity than that, right? But further down in the article, it talks about, or it states, by removing partisan politics from community discussions about climate policy, it's sometimes possible to reach a consensus that's been difficult to achieve at a national level. I think that's the overall message, that we can do this at a local level. We can separate out all the noise that's happening around us at the national level. And overall, we just want to focus on developing a positive community and make a community inspiring for our future generations. And I couldn't state something about the Morris Liquor Store without showing you a picture of it. Yes, we actually have solar panels on that, along with several other city buildings as well. So in conclusion, if I was going to give advice, I'd say educate at all levels to improve awareness and drive cultural change, set local goals and develop a project list. As Ben Franklin said, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Build community support. It's amazing what you can do when you're speaking with one voice anywhere you are. work together to provide technical and financial framework for successful projects, visit Morris or visit a similar community, and then find people that can lead the way. That's another important part. You need leaders to step out and say, I'm going to do this. This is important to me. So with that, I'd like to thank several of our partners in this effort, and especially want to thank the medical school for hosting this event. So thank you very much.
That's so impressive. I mean, if a talk does not include a liquor store with solar panels. So thank you so much. That's going to generate some questions. And just a reminder, put your questions down in the Q&A. So now it is my pleasure to bring in Kathy Jordan. Dr. Jordan serves as the Director for Leadership and Education at the Institute on the Environment and as the Director of the Research for the Children in Nature Network, which is a national nonprofit. At INE, Dr. Jordan leads a team that cultivates sustainability awareness in students and supports sustainability savvy leaders with social, emotional, and thinking skills that make them more effective change agents. As a pediatric neuropsychologist, Dr. Jordan has had a longstanding interest in the influence of environment on children's health and development. So Dr. Jordan, can you discuss with us the positive impact of nature on children's physical and mental health and educational outcomes and the development of the stewardship ethic?
Absolutely. Want to make sure you can see my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up there? Thanks, Aganesh. Just want to declare I have no current or potential conflicts of interest. So moving right along. So at the Children in Nature Network, we have a saying that nature helps children be happier, healthier, smarter, or more academically successful, and better stewards of the environment. And I'm going to touch on each of these briefly, and then I'm going to tie them together in a context of planetary health. So what do I mean by happier? So we're really talking about mental and cognitive health benefits, things like decreased anxiety, decreased depression, more positive mood, better resilience, better regulation, behavioral and emotional regulation, and then attention restoration and stress reduction. I'm going to come back to those two in a few minutes. What do I mean by healthier in the happier, healthier, smarter, better stewards of the environment way of thinking about this? So healthier is like more physical activity, which helps prevent obesity, and it helps prevent chronic illnesses, chronic health issues, certainly in adulthood, although we're also seeing them in children now, things that are like heart disease and diabetes, things that we attribute to sort of lifestyle behaviors or choices that often have to do with sedentary behavior. And then microbiota is another important thing when kids have interaction with nature, with dirt in particular. There's microbiota there that are really crucial for our immune system, the health of our guts, and also brain health. And then what do I mean by smarter and better at school? So research supports the idea that learning in and through nature can result in more knowledge acquisition across a variety of subject matters, better test performance like standardized achievement test scores. The question is really why? What are the mechanisms behind that? To some degree, nature is a great teacher. You can effectively teach content and skills in a range of subject matter from earth science to physics to math, history, art, music, language arts, through interaction with nature, really embedded in nature and utilizing the context of nature and the natural elements to teach across the curriculum. It's not education about the environment so much, although it could be, but it's utilizing the natural environment in teaching across the curriculum. Nature provides meaning and relevance to students, and students feel engaged when they're learning in a nature-based learning sort of way. They also tend to self-regulate better through interacting with challenges and risks in the environment. They learn to regulate themselves. But there also seems to be something that's not about the pedagogy of nature-based learning. It's something about nature itself, something about the greenery or the natural environment that results in cognitive and emotional states that contribute to learning. So remember earlier, I said I was going to come back to talking about attention restoration and stress reduction. So with stress reduction, this is one of two theories about how nature really affects us. And it basically says that nature has physiological effects on us, like lowering our cortisol levels. Cortisol is a hormone that is released in response to stress that can be like helpful in the moment, like fight or flight sort of thing, or increase our arousal in an appropriate way. But chronically high levels of cortisol are actually damaging to our health, to our thinking, to our happiness. So this is one way that nature gets under the skin in this sort of physiological sort of way. And I'll give you a research example that's looking at actual kids and their stress levels. So in Germany, they looked at 37 fifth graders who spent 1 day a week in a forest setting for their whole school day. They did sort of school outside. And 11 were in the control group that didn't experience that 1 day a week in the forest. The intervention group, which is represented in the left-hand graph here, the cortisol for those kids showed a normal daily rhythm where it sort of starts high in the morning and then it goes down over the course of the day and sort of levels out at about noon or so. For the control group shown in the right graph, they had sort of an elevated level of cortisol all day long. It didn't show that healthy diurnal rhythm. So it's great that the kids who were learning in quote forest school showed sort of a healthy, sort of stress physiology. It's actually kind of worrisome that the kids in the regular classroom, just sort of regular education, were chronically stressed. And we know that chronic stress contributes to poor educational performance, poor learning, poor mental health in the school setting. The other prominent theory often invoked about how nature impacts our mental and our cognitive function is the attention restoration theory. And this says that there are two systems of attention. One of them is called the directed or the effortful attention system. This is the one that we use when we're really, working or studying and really, really trying to focus, and it takes effort to do that. And then there's another one called the non-directed or the effortless system that kicks in when we're doing something like walking in the woods, listening to the birds or staring at the clouds. It's just, it's just kind of what we call soft fascination is another way of thinking about it. And the idea is that the kicking in of the non-directed attention system gives the directed attention system a break, so that when you come back to that work setting or that school setting and you have to pay attention again in that effortful way, that system is ready to go. It's had some restoration. This has been studied. Attention restoration has been studied in a variety of ways in the laboratory, out in the real world. There's one flavor of research that basically tests how well people, kids or adults, pay attention after they've spent time in nature, like going for a walk in nature versus either spending time indoors or outside in a more urban or built up environment, like walking on a city street. The researchers in these studies typically find that the nature walk results in better attention when they are tested afterwards on an attention demanding task like trying to repeat increasingly long series of digits backwards. Even 10 minutes if in nature is helpful, but like only if you actually are paying attention to the nature. If you're like really, kind of paying attention to, ruminations, trying to solve a problem in your head, or you're worried about something, and you're not paying attention to the nature, it doesn't really work. But if you are, letting nature do its magic on you, then it doesn't actually take that much time for nature to actually restore your attentional function. So in contrast to attention, which tends to be a temporary state, like, sometimes we pay attention and sometimes we don't pay attention, intelligence is more stable. In fact, we used to think, at least, that intelligence was not mutable. It's like you were born with it or you weren't. You are what you are. But we have learned that aspects of the environment can affect intelligence and IQ test performance, both in good and bad ways, but it's just kind of a slow process. It's not a momentary state like attention. So intelligence as an outcome that might be able to be impacted by nature and greenery, that's a relatively new area of interest, but there are studies that are demonstrating a connection between greenery and intelligence. So for example, there was a study of twins in Belgium between the ages of 7 and 15 that found that there was a significant relationship between greenery around the children's homes and IQ overall, as well as what's called verbal IQ and then the more nonverbal or visual motor kind of intelligence. But that was only true for the kids who were in urban areas. That's the top purple line in each of these graphs. So the higher the percentage of green space around the home, which is around the bottom horizontal axis moving off to the right, the higher the IQ score was, and that's the vertical axis going up. So that wasn't true for suburban or rural kids, but it was true for the urban kids in a significantly positive direction. So these findings are relevant for policymakers and urban planners who have they have a really special opportunity to plan urban environments to support children's optimal healthy development through nature and greenery. Now, it's one thing to think about nature exposure supporting kids' performance on an IQ test, which, as we said, is relatively more stable than attention, but still mutable. But it's another thing to think about nature being so powerful that it actually changes the brain's structure as the brain develops. But that actually can happen. In a study of school children in Barcelona, the amount of greenery around the homes of these children over the course of these children's lives was correlated with MRI scan data looking at brain volumes. So the more greenery, the bigger the brain in certain areas that tended to be associated with things like memory and attention, which are critical for learning. So nature really can build a better brain sort of in real time. Okay, so we've talked about nature making kids happier, healthier, smarter, better in school. And then the final area I talked about was better stewards of the environment. So contact with nature, from nature play as a young child to nature-based learning in school, which I talked about earlier, to camping on family vacations, to wilderness adventure trips as teenagers. All of these forms of nature engagement and many, many more all contribute to creating an emotional connection to nature. And research shows that it is that critical emotional connection to nature that forms the foundation for becoming a better steward of the environment. We used to think that in traditional environmental education ways of thinking, that if we just told people, kids included, what the environmental problems were and what to do about it, then they would act. They would engage in some environmental behavior or become stewards of the environment. But humans don't actually work that way. So when we experience an emotional connection to nature, it alters our environment, it alters our attitudes towards being more pro-environmental. And then those attitudes open us up to taking in that knowledge about the environment and environmental problems and solutions. And then that emotional connection also serves as motivation for taking action. And altogether, this series of sequential impacts leads to the propensity to act in pro-environmental ways, to become a better steward of the environment. So I want to end by drawing a model with pictures here about the connection between the impacts of nature that I've been talking about and planetary health. So nature impacts, as we've talked about, kids' health, happiness and well-being, academic success, self-regulation, all leading to full capacity to act, as shown along the top thread of this diagram. And it produces that emotional connectedness to nature, which drives environmental behavior, which is shown along the bottom picture. And in turn, kids, and also the adults that they grow up to be, are more likely then to protect the earth, work to align with the principles of planetary health and address climate change, for example. And then the healthier planet then supports children's health and well-being and full functioning. So it's like this positive cycle, from kids to planet and back to kids, and it can scale outwards in terms of influencing all aspects of life. And it can also cross generations as kids grow into youth and youth grow into adults and they have their own children. and they're influencing their own children's development through connecting them to nature as they were connected to nature by their own parents and their teachers. So my advice, my sort of spin on how do we act is about connecting kids to nature through nature play, family engagement in nature, nature-based learning, wilderness adventure, and really solid, thoughtful urban planning that creates nature in all of our environments, including where it is most lacking, which is in the urban environment. And I will stop there. Thank you so much.
I'm glad I was on mute because I was like, yes, yes, yes. I'm a mother of 3 kids under the age of 10, and it's very different, like parenting them at camp or in nature than it is parenting them when they haven't had a lot of exposure. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And now we get to hear from Katie Pelican. Dr. Pelican is an associate professor in the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine at the College of Veterinary Medicine. Dr. Pelican co-founded the Strategic Partnership and Research Collaborative Office to support the university system-wide large-scale interdisciplinary research development and resource mobilization to launch high-impact programs to solve the world's most challenging problems. Easy enough, right? She's also co-founded and leads the a system-wide sustainable development goal initiative to focus dispersed university resources on high-impact global to local work. So, Dr. Pelican, can you tell us about the systems approach to tackling these really complex, big challenges that you're trying to affect?
Thank you so much, Ganesh, and hello, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the work I've done around systems change with complex problems. And the work I've been doing, I have no conflicts. I've worked in systems work in 30 countries over the last 15 years, and that work is mostly focused in the realms of One Health and Sustainable Development Goals, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But they all focus, as does planetary health, I think, on the complexity, on these very, very complex issues that we are increasingly facing. And probably one of the good examples that we can all appreciate now is, for example, the recent pandemic. This was an issue that I think we go into these public health crises thinking these are public health crises, but in fact, they're crises that affect many, many systems. And I think we all appreciate that now. Food, workforce, education, transportation, political stability and conflict, mental health, equity and equality, all of these things were affected by this disease. And in order to manage the risk and the issues that we face around this disease, you need to think in a systems-based way across all of these systems. So the One Health approach is focused on humans, animals, and the environment. It's basically a collaborative or multi-sectoral approach to addressing challenges that arise at this intersection of animal health, human health, and the environment. This is actually a very recent definition of One Health that was developed by what's now being called the Quadripartite, which is World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, and recently added to this group was the United Nations Environmental Program. So good news, people are starting to recognize that environment is really important. And then I also am working in a different framework, but I think it's all kind of the same approach, right? It's about integrating across many different sectors and issues. So the Sustainable Development Goals, there's our globally agreed to framework for the big challenges we're facing as a globe. What's new about Sustainable Development Goals compared to previous frameworks is that it links human issues, social issues like poverty and hunger and sustainable cities with environmental issues like climate change and life below water and life on land. So it's meant to be an integrated framework. So I see so many connections with these big frameworks, and basically we're all trying to struggle with these complex problems. So just to say a little bit about some of the tools and approaches that I've used and some sort of lessons learned from the last 15 years. I think the one thing to think about here, if we're thinking about solutions, is what are some of the factors we need to consider when we think about collaborating? Because the big thing we need to do with these complex issues is collaborate across all of those sectors and all of those approaches that we just talked about. And this was actually, we used a qualitative assessment of literature to understand what are factors that affect One Health collaborations. This was focused on infectious disease. And what we see is that there are individual factors. A person needs to have the skills to work effectively, collaboratively. There's organizational factors. Organizationals need to act in a collaborative way and support the people in them to be collaborative. And then we need starting conditions. We need the leadership. We need the relationships in order to work well in these environments. And so when we think about creating systems that will affect change, that will be able to manage these complex issues, we need to think about these different factors. This was our definition of a One Health workforce as part of a USAID funded project that we worked with universities in. What is a One Health workforce? What is a workforce that's functional? It needs to have multi-sectoral skills. It needs to be able to collaborate effectively. You need to have the skills, the technical skills to contribute to the team, right? I need to be a good veterinarian. And then we need an enabling environment. Again, we come back to these sort of systems that need to support the collaboration. A lot of my knowledge, in addition to that USAID project, has come from a tool that I developed called the One Health Systems Mapping and Analysis Resource Toolkit, or OSMART. And this basically is a tool that uses social science tools and business process tools to help different actors in a system collaborate on understanding how they can function better as a system. So this involves some stakeholder mapping, some interviewing and qualitative kind of research. And core to it is this mapping, and this is collaborative mapping. This is process mapping. A lot of businesses use it, but we use it a little differently. Each of these swim lanes, what we call swim lanes here, is basically a different actor in the system. So a different organization, ministry, or a laboratory. And the actual groups themselves sit down and map out how they collaborate and coordinate. So it helps them see their system. And as they do that, they actually identify areas where there's questions. We call these discrepancies. There's questions or there's conflict, and they mark them. And then they decide what should happen at those points. And then they create an action plan to improve the system. So that's sort of the heart and soul. It's an action plan, an analysis and action planning tool. And we've used this in 20 countries now at different levels of civil society. And that's helped us better understand these complex systems and what are some of the factors that we need to get them to collaborate better. And we've looked at lots of different complex issues, from climate change resilience in the Arctic Council and circumpolar countries, to very, very community level issues like youth engagement and tribal food sovereignty in a tribal nation here in Minnesota. Sustainable development goals, we're also building out as a tool to think in a more systems-based way. Because it's an integrated framework, it works very well that way. So we've actually mapped different issues against all the sustainable development goals. This was a sort of a mapping I did around agricultural response, emergency response. And we asked, how does poverty influence agricultural emergency response? How does health influence? That's pretty obvious. How does safe water? And it turns, if you really think about sustainable development goals that way, you see that it can help you actually think in a more systems-based way about any issue that's being faced. So just to, very, very in short, think about some of the lessons that we've learned using these tools and approaches in all these countries and at these different levels. When we think about work at the intergovernmental level, like the Arctic Council, which is all the countries that surround the Arctic, what we see is that, there's a lot of guidance coming out. There's a lot of talk about how different countries should be working together. And these intergovernmental agencies are assigning tasks basically to countries, their partner countries, their member countries, so they agree. But it's very challenging to achieve those at the national level. And there's obviously national silos between nations, and that there's a lot of tools that exist, but countries can't always use them effectively in implementing. At the national level, of course, this is sort of the major functional level in terms of action for a lot of these things like sustainable development goals. But national governments are very siloed. The Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Transportation and the Ministry of Agriculture don't really have very many connections among them. And yet, as we saw with COVID, they need to collaborate around these complex challenges. So there are sort of systemic problems pretty much in every country we've looked at in communication. Connections do exist. All of these places have connections, but almost always they're ad hoc. And people have connections because they know people or they've worked together before. So, and then a lot of the financial systems and other structures within the national government really prevent that collaboration. Then if we move down the sort of civil society level to subnational states and provinces, that kind of formalized civil society level, what we see is that there are as many vertical challenges in terms of collaboration as there are horizontal across agencies. So, we'd actually used OSMART to look at how counties and state and national were collaborating around avian influenza. And the answer is poorly. And in fact, a lot of expertise and efficiency gets left on the table because there's no connections and they're not collaborating effectively. And then I think one thing to point out is a lot of the work I've done has been in mobilizing universities in some of these contexts, and universities can play an important role, but they're kind of poor at it. They're not great. They don't always see themselves as being the mobilizing force that they can be, because they are trusted. They're often trusted. They are respected. They are neutral. They have all this research capacity and expertise. And so, some of my work around the Spark office that we just talked about is really about that. Like, how do we mobilize universities to be as effective as they might in addressing these systems challenges? And then at the community, communities, of course, are actually where things happen. This is where climate change rubber meets the road, as we heard about in the Morris example. And yet, it's very challenging for communities to be, they can create action, but it's hard to scale up that action. And so many communities, like the ones we've been working with, and some of the indigenous communities, are very marginalized and have had historically poor relationships with states, with countries. And so sort of that can be a big barrier to supporting a systems-based approach and to supporting these communities effectively. And so, and I guess one thing I've definitely learned is that for many of these communities, it's not like a ministry talking to a ministry, right? There are bad actors in the mix that are actually traumatizing to them. So it needs to be very carefully done. And then even at the institutional level. So I've worked with a lot of universities, for example, and a lot of governments. So similarly, it turns out we're really bad as a species at collaborating. And we have siloed systems at all levels, right? And that's true at the institutional level as well. So how do we create connections and mobilize teams? Well, one thing is to work in peacetime, as they say, in addition to when we're facing an emergency, work collaboratively at all times. But I also think people are eager to help and want to offer things, but they don't always have access into this system because it's so complex. So I think I've said everything here. These are sort of my overall lessons. you know, we need to do better at collaborating. I do think there's access into those systems. And we're learning a lot as we are dealing with these complex issues. And we need to do a better job of learning and doing better in the future. So thank you.
I'm so inspired by even you tackling problems at that level, because it feels so much easier to do it in the individual level. But I love how you showed us how important that work is as well. So thank you so much for that, Katie. Now we get into the fun of it with some question and answers. And we'd love to kind of circle back to you, Michael, if you don't mind. Tell us a little bit about what kind of drove Morris to create this collaborative? You know, what was the why all of a sudden, why now did you guys create this? And then what have you learned from it that could potentially be replicated in other cities?
That's a great question, Saganesh. Really appreciate that. I think the reason, the root of why we did this was that we were trying to look forward in making our community better. You know, we're a rural farming community. When we first began working in renewable energy from a university standpoint, the drive was to increase profitability for farmers, increase economic development opportunities for our rural communities, and generate wealth where wealth was needed and is needed. And along with that, we have our University of Minnesota Morris campus, one of the main partners, and the student body itself was saying, we want to work towards these goals. We want to work towards renewable energy and waste reduction, and so to some extent, the students were the core. You know, they were the cheerleaders. They're the ones that started this whole process. I think the lessons learned and how does an organization or how does a community start this? I think first of all, you probably need leaders to step up and say, again, this is important, and try to organize, try to keep the national noise outside of the discussion, try to find a common goal. We want to improve our community. We want to make it better for our children and future generations, and things that everyone can agree upon. And then once you get to that point, we try to find sub goals that everyone can work towards. And as you start piling up the projects, one project leads to another project, one partnership leads to another partnership, and it's a cascading effect. So that's my advice. Thank you. You're muted.
No, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I was just gonna give either Katie or Kathy an opportunity to kind of talk about that, sort of the whys behind the work that you did. And Katie did a great job giving us the overall lessons.
I started my life as a wildlife veterinarian. And, I think in any work, we're increasingly finding you can't do things without that collaborative element, right? And so that sort of brought me, I always say I started out, wrangling animals, and now I wrangle people. Turns out, supporting people to collaborate is important to deal with these issues. And so I've sort of backed into becoming an expert in managing, and sort of supporting collaboration among people. But yeah, I would never have guessed that when I was deciding to be a veterinarian.
I think that intersection is just so powerful in the story that you talked about. Kathy, I want to ask you a question about like bigger kids or adults. So we've kind of talked us through this positive impact of nature on children and how it really leads them to develop stewardship ethic. And I know this may be outside of your scope, but how do we develop this in older individuals? Is there any data or lessons learned for big kids like me?
Sure. There's a lot of research on adults as well as children, and I think there's a special period of time. I won't say it's the critical period, meaning it doesn't work if you try to do it outside of this period of time. But there's a special period of time, which is in childhood, where a really strong connection to nature can be built. But actually, what we see in the research is that like connectedness to nature kind of you can get it to go higher in sort of early childhood and middle childhood, and then it sort of tanks in adolescence, and then it rebounds in adults. It's like, teenagers get wonky, and then you kind of restore your connectedness to nature. So it's certainly important to be connected to nature for all the reasons that I talked about in terms of health and mental health and well-being, and sort of developing your own connection to nature for becoming an environmental steward. You can do that at any stage in life. It's just that when parents and teachers connect kids at a younger age, it can be pretty powerful. So it's stronger for younger kids than for older kids and us big kids, but we're still worth doing. And we can do it through nature, engagement as a family, going to parks, doing some camping together, going on hikes, going to the beach, even just choices of where we live, trying to be more surrounded by greenery and walkable places that we can walk to in nature. Those are important decisions that adults make for their whole family.
Yeah, and that's coming out a lot, even in like adult medicine literature. The conversations around nature and mood and concentration, I think, is also starting to be looked at more. So those benefits are real.
Yeah, they say 120 minutes a week. Doesn't matter
think
if that's all at one time or
I'm gonna
like,
take it all in
20 minutes a
Jamaica in
day.
January. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right. So we have a lot of readers in the audience, and there's a question here for all of you. Are there books that you would recommend related to like the benefits of nature we're talking about, or helping reduce our footprints, like Mike was talking about, impacts of infectious disease on planetary health? Any book recommendations that you would have?
I just put my response in the Q&A for folks. So if others want to tackle this one, mine's already documented.
I don't know if I haven't read it yet, but I'm planning to read it soon. I just received this book called Speed and Scale: Action for Solving Our Climate Crisis Now. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. So it's a #1 from #1 New York Times bestselling author John Doerr. And the other book that I would recommend is Alchemy of Air, and it doesn't have anything to do with community, but it has something to do with our research in creating green nitrogen fertilizer, which is a very energy intensive process typically, and we use quite a bit of nitrogen fertilizer in rural Minnesota, and we're trying to decarbonize that process and decarbonize agricultural production.
It's a good question in terms of One Health. There's a lot of sort of, well, I would say there's scare books like Spillover and the Hot Zone and things like that. But unfortunately, we just lived through them. So, and then in terms of, the One Health literature, I would say has not been in the sort of general public reading, which is unfortunate because I feel like we have a lot to offer, actually, in a more positive message than I think has been given in the past. So I'm not sure that's all that helpful, but.
We talked about last week how it's really easy in this work to focus on all the problems because there's so many of them. But what I love about all of your work is it's very solutions focused, and sort of here are different ways that we can tackle this problem. And reading books or inspirational things around that are always, I think, important. And hearing your stories is really important. Let's see. So we have a question here for Mike. How are we long past the movie day of Who Killed the Electric Car?
Yes, we are. We're right here and coming to you from Morris, conservative farming community. There's every day I hear, electric cars are bad, just like the internet. So, but I think there's definitely a role for electric vehicles. The technology is amazing. We're getting range extended to a point where it's actually viable for people that live 150 miles away from the Twin Cities can drive there and get back and not have to spend hours charging. And 65% of the vehicles that we drive in Minnesota are pickups and SUVs. And the exciting part about EVs is that now we have the opportunities, or we're just having the opportunities to start driving pickups that are electric and perform extremely well. I've driven Ford Lightning. There are other SUVs as well as coming around. And so for Minnesota, for rural areas, that will be a game changer. And having that range extension is going to be very important. And so, especially with the high fossil fuel costs and the environmental impacts, I think we're past this as being a fad. I would say that from an agricultural standpoint, we have a lot of opportunities to electrify agriculture as well, but there are benefits for biofuels still, or medium to larger scale transportation, and also for aviation fuels. And so I think it's not either or, it's both. We need both.
Yeah. I want to ask a question, this is the worst probably segue, but speaking of technology, Kathy, one of the struggles we have with kids is this competition of technology versus nature. So wanting to play a video game, or watch YouTube videos, which my children do. So give us some thoughts around that and what we can do.
Yeah. In the Q&A, we've been talking about books by Richard Louv, who is a journalist by trade and has done a great job sort of bringing to light the issues. And in his first book, Last Child in the Woods, he has a quote in there of a young child when asked, do you like to go outside? The kid says no. And Richard Louv asks, why not? And he says, because inside is where the electrical outlets are. And it's sort of a sad commentary. But I think there's this is a real issue. Quote unquote screen time is an issue, but it's not a dichotomy. I think there's ways that we can integrate technology with engagement in nature in ways that sort of tap into the ways children, particularly this generation of digital natives, are really passionate about their technology. There are so many nature apps that can really help you understand what it is you're interacting with in nature. There's ways that you can use your phone or iPads or whatever to take pictures and identify things, or to create a sort of digital story, or you can get creative and integrate the two so that you're not saying to a kid like the digital stuff is bad and the nature stuff is good. I think that's a mistake, and we really need to figure out how do we marry the two of them effectively, and we just don't go too far into the screen time side such that we're sedentary and not getting any outdoor time. Bring the technology outdoors if that's going to be motivating for kids.
I love that, like that false dichotomy of either or, but trying to get to the end. So I want to ask this of all of you, and Katie, I'd love to start with you on this. We're talking about these super complex, complicated issues that are sometimes hard to understand, even some of the terms and terminology that we use. So how have you found a way to kind of take these concepts, these main concepts, and make them relatable or understandable to the general public in a way that kind of motivates change or allows for success?
I think complexity is challenging for us. I think we're a species that lives in complexity, but doesn't understand complexity very well. So, but we all care about things. So to me, I would, in my experience, focusing on what is important to you, to the person, what are you passionate about, and building a coalition. I think the work where I've learned things is not only just cool to work with people from other disciplines and fun, and you get to learn a lot of things, but you're actually more effective. So if what you care about, like the tribal college that I'm working with OSMART, it started with, we need to feed our community. They were having significant food insecurity issues in their community. Well, then start just asking the question, who is involved? Who in the community is working in this arena, and who might be useful to help us, people in transportation or people in nonprofits or people in the state, build that coalition and think broadly. I guess that's what I would say, because it's actually fun. I mean, and you don't have to know everything. No one knows everything. People might think they know everything, but trust me, you don't. No one does. And so that's why you need the coalition, right? Because that brings different viewpoints. And suddenly you're like, oh, okay, now we have a group that can see the bigger picture, and can bring different tools together to really be effective in doing innovative new things.
Kathy or Mike, your thoughts on this? Okay, you're just saying embrace the complexity and let's use this as an opportunity. Yes.
I guess I'll go maybe a little bit in the opposite direction. I certainly approve of embracing complexity, but I think with kids in nature, there's lots of stuff that we still don't know about, that we are very interested in understanding, particularly around mechanisms and the sort of neurophysiology and all that sort of stuff. But as Richard Louv says, we have enough information to act. We know now that this is good, and we know something about how to do it well. The more biodiverse, the higher quality the nature, the better for our health. The more time we spend outdoors in ways that are sort of mindful of the nature, the better. The more that we teach children through nature-based learning, the better. The more we allow children to have free playtime in nature, the better. That's enough to go on. And as a, sort of all of us as citizens, we can trust that the research is there that would back up why, or what's the mechanism behind why that has the impact that it does. And at this point, just know if the research is there, just do the nature engagement and the impacts will follow.
And I would say that again, I agree with Katie that you don't need to do this all yourself. We don't know all the answers. We can't do this all ourselves. Seek out those people that have the same goals as you have, and in some respects take the path of least resistance. Develop this organization, this collaboration, and bring people resources into the equation. Nothing gets done without people. People are the core, and so it needs to start someplace. So find you could be a leader. You could find a group of leaders and start building from there, and identify where you can make the most impact, and then start making small steps towards goals. And one small success leads to another small success, leads to another small success. And then you look back and you can say, that was one big success.
This was so great, you guys. It was so inspiring to hear your stories and to get like the tangible work that you're doing. So thank you, thank you, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your insights, both on a local and a global level, and helping us understand the intersections of humans and animals and the changing environment. So thank you so much. And we also really want to thank our participants. We want to thank you for joining us today. We'll hopefully see you here next week for our third mini medical school session. This is all about creating a better future, which will be at the same time next Wednesday. We again will have an amazing group of experts that will discuss inspiring the next generation of sustainable leaders and helping us build a future for all life on Earth. So thank you very much. We'll see you next week.